She doesn't even know what we're saying, the billionaire CEO said in Arabic, smiling into his crystal glass. And somehow they expect people like her to serve a table like this. The men around him laughed, low and confident, the kind of laughter that comes from people who believe money can buy privacy. It rolled across the private dining room of the St. Clair Hotel in downtown Chicago, mixing with the soft piano music, the clink of silverware, and the quiet hum of a city glowing outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. No one expected an answer. No one even looked at the young black waitress standing beside the table. Naomi Brooks simply adjusted the bottle of sparkling water in her hand and kept moving. Her expression never changed. Her shoulders stayed straight. Her footsteps stayed calm. To the guests, she was part of the furniture, another uniform in another luxury restaurant where billion-dollar deals were signed over perfectly cooked steaks and expensive wine. Across the table sat Ethan Callaway, the white billionaire CEO of Callaway Global Freight, a man who had built an empire connecting ports across the world. At 39, he had magazine covers, private jets, and a reputation for always getting what he wanted. Investors admired him. Competitors feared him. Employees learned very quickly that Ethan enjoyed being the smartest person in any room. Tonight was supposed to be another victory. A group of wealthy international investors had flown in from across the country to discuss a partnership worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Every seat at the table mattered. Every word carried weight. Ethan knew it, and he enjoyed the attention. He leaned toward one of his executives and switched back to Arabic. "Watch this," he whispered with a grin. "I could tell her to bring us the moon, and she would probably smile and ask if we wanted lemon with it." Another round of laughter followed. One guest covered his mouth. Another shook his head, almost uncomfortable, but no one spoke up. Naomi reached for an empty glass and replaced it with a clean one. Her hands never shook. Her eyes never lifted from her work. She thanked a guest for moving his plate and continued around the table as if she had heard nothing at all. Ethan watched her for a second and smiled to himself. Silence, he thought, was proof that he was right. He had no idea that silence could mean something else entirely. Near the end of the table sat an older gentleman with silver hair and a quiet face. He had barely touched his dinner. He noticed Naomi's calm expression. He noticed the tiny pause before she set down a fresh napkin. He noticed the way her eyes flickered for the briefest moment when Ethan spoke Arabic again. The old man looked from Ethan to Naomi and back again, saying nothing. Outside, a flash of lightning lit up the Chicago skyline, and the reflection in the glass made the room seem even larger than it was. Ethan raised his glass for another toast. "To success," he said in English, loud enough for everyone to hear. Then he smiled and added something in Arabic that made the table laugh one more time. Naomi stopped for exactly 1 second. She turned slowly toward him. She placed the bottle gently on the table. The piano player in the corner finished his song, and for a heartbeat the entire room felt strangely quiet. Ethan looked up, expecting another polite smile from the waitress he had spent the evening ignoring. Instead, Naomi looked directly into his eyes, and the first words she spoke that night were in flawless Arabic. The smile disappeared from Ethan Callaway's face so quickly that even the guests closest to him noticed it. Naomi Brooks did not raise her voice. She did not try to embarrass him. She simply answered his last remark in smooth, confident Arabic, her words calm and precise, carrying across the quiet dining room like a note from the piano that had stopped playing seconds before. For a moment, nobody moved. The city lights outside the windows kept shining. Ice settled inside crystal glasses. A server in the hallway froze with a tray balanced in his hands. Ethan blinked once, almost expecting someone to laugh and tell him it was a joke. Naomi waited politely, her hands folded in front of her apron. Then she spoke again in Arabic, this time with a warm smile. She apologized for interrupting his conversation and asked if he would like fresh coffee with dessert. One of the international investors nearly dropped his fork. Another guest slowly leaned forward in his chair. The older silver-haired gentleman at the end of the table looked at Naomi with new interest. Ethan forced a laugh and switched back to English. "Well, that is unexpected," he said, trying to sound amused. Naomi nodded politely. "Yes, sir," she answered. "Would you like cream with your coffee?" She gave him an easy way out. She gave him the chance to move on and save face. But pride has a strange way of making simple moments complicated. Ethan looked around the table and noticed people watching him instead of admiring him. That was unusual. He had spent years controlling rooms exactly like this one. Investors waited for his opinion. Reporters chased his comments. Board members measured their words around him. Yet somehow a waitress had changed the direction of the evening without raising her voice. Ethan smiled again, but this time it took effort. He switched back to Arabic. "Where did you learn that language?" he asked, convinced that a simple greeting was all she knew. Naomi answered immediately. Her accent was smooth. Her grammar was flawless. The investor sitting beside Ethan slowly lowered his glass. The older gentleman at the end of the table could not hide a small grin. Ethan asked another question, a little faster this time. Naomi answered that one too. Then another. Then another. Every reply came with the same calm expression, as though this conversation belonged to an ordinary Tuesday night, instead of the middle of a business dinner worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Around the room, whispers started to spread. Staff members exchanged glances. One guest quietly reached for his phone, not to record, but to search for the translation of a phrase Naomi had just used. Ethan sat back in his chair. For the first time that evening, he was not leading the conversation. Naomi noticed his empty water glass. She picked up the bottle and filled it carefully. "Thank you," Ethan said automatically before realizing what he had done. Naomi smiled. "You are very welcome, sir," she replied in English. The older gentleman finally spoke. His voice was gentle but carried across the table. "Young lady," he said, "your Arabic sounds remarkable. May I ask where you learned it?" Naomi looked toward him with quiet respect. She opened her mouth to answer, but before a single word left her lips, the gentleman smiled and said, "Actually, I think I already know." Naomi looked at the older gentleman with quiet curiosity. The room had changed. A few minutes earlier, she had been invisible, another server carrying trays through a dinner for people who measured success in stock prices and private flights. Now every eye at the table rested on her. Ethan Calloway noticed it too. The attention that usually belonged to him had shifted across the room, and he was not sure how to take it back. The older gentleman folded his napkin neatly beside his plate and smiled. 20 years ago," he said, "I spent nearly a decade working throughout the Middle East. You do not simply memorize a few phrases and sound like that. Language carries history. It carries family. It carries respect." Naomi gave a small nod. "My grandmother used to say the same thing, sir," she answered. The gentleman laughed softly. "Then your grandmother was a wise woman." Ethan leaned forward. "You still did not answer the question," he said. His voice was polite, but there was something else hiding underneath it. Curiosity, pride, maybe even a little frustration. Naomi reached for the coffee pot and carefully refilled the older gentleman's cup before answering. "I learned because someone believed that understanding another person is one of the best investments you can make." The gentleman smiled again. Ethan frowned. "That sounds like a speech, not an answer." Naomi looked at him. "Sometimes they are the same thing, sir." A few guests chuckled. Not at Ethan. With Naomi. The sound caught him off guard. Across the table, one of the investors finally spoke. "I have to admit, I am impressed. Most people in my company struggle to learn one foreign language." Another guest nodded. "My children studied Arabic for 4 years. They would never hold a conversation that smoothly." Naomi thanked them and continued serving dessert. She never hurried. She never acted as though she had won anything. Ethan watched her move through the room. Every guest suddenly seemed interested in talking to her. They asked where she was from. They asked what other languages she knew. They asked about the city and the restaurant. Naomi answered every question with the same calm confidence, never staying long enough to make herself the center of attention. The older gentleman took a slow sip of coffee. "Young lady," he said, "your grandmother must have been extraordinary." Naomi smiled. She was a school librarian on the south side of Chicago. She believed books could take people anywhere if they were willing to open them. The gentleman tapped the table gently. "There it is," he said. "I knew I recognized that accent. Your Arabic teacher was not just teaching vocabulary. Someone taught you culture." Naomi nodded. "Yes, sir." Ethan looked from Naomi to the older man. "You sound like you know quite a bit about this." The gentleman smiled. "I should hope so. I spent years building educational programs overseas." One of the investors suddenly sat up straighter. "Wait a second," he said. "Are you Daniel Whitaker?" The gentleman gave a modest shrug. "I suppose I am." The table fell silent again. Even Ethan knew the name. Daniel Whitaker was a respected philanthropist whose foundation funded schools and language programs across the world. Daniel looked back at Naomi. "I have one more question for you," he said. "When your grandmother told you that understanding people was an investment, what did she say the return would be?" Naomi did not hesitate. She smiled and answered. She said that one day, the person everyone ignores might understand the room better than the people trying to control it. Daniel Whitaker's question lingered over the table like the last note of a song that nobody wanted to interrupt. Naomi Brooks stood quietly with the coffee pot in her hand, her smile small but steady. She said that one day, the person everyone ignores might understand the room better than the people trying to control it. The words settled into the silence. A few guests looked down at their plates. Others looked toward Ethan Calloway without meaning to. Ethan noticed every glance. He had spent his entire career reading negotiations, studying expressions, and finding weakness before anyone else could see it. Tonight he was seeing something he did not like. Control was slipping away from him, one quiet conversation at a time. Daniel leaned back in his chair and laughed softly. "I think I would have liked your grandmother very much," he said. Naomi nodded. "Most people did, sir." Another investor smiled. "Did she teach you Arabic too?" Naomi shook her head. "No, sir. She taught me to be curious. The language came later." Daniel folded his hands together. "That is usually how the best education begins." Ethan looked at his watch and forced a grin. "Well, this has certainly turned into a fascinating language seminar." A few people laughed politely, but the conversation did not return to him. Instead, one of the investors looked at Naomi. "How many languages do you speak?" Naomi thought for a moment. "Enough to make people feel welcome," she answered. Daniel laughed again. "That is the best answer I have heard all year." Ethan picked up his water glass. "Come on now. You have to give us a number." Naomi looked at him. "5 well enough to hold a conversation, sir." The room grew quiet again. Ethan nearly set his glass down too quickly. 5. Naomi nodded. English, Arabic, Spanish, French, and a little Italian. Daniel smiled proudly as though he had known her for years. "You forgot one thing." Naomi looked confused. "Sir, kindness," Daniel said. "That one is becoming a rare language these days." A few people around the table clapped softly. Ethan looked toward the windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. He was used to being the success story in any room. He was the man who had built warehouses across the country and turned a family trucking business into a billion-dollar company. People usually asked for his advice. They usually wanted his attention. Tonight they were asking questions of a waitress carrying dessert plates. One of his executives leaned closer and whispered, "We should probably get the meeting back on track." Ethan nodded quickly. "Good idea." He stood and raised his glass. "Ladies and gentlemen, perhaps we should focus on why we are here tonight." Daniel looked at him with a friendly smile. "I agree. Business matters." Ethan relaxed a little. Daniel continued, "But before we begin, I have one small question for your team." Ethan smiled. "Of course." Daniel looked around the table. "The partnership we are discussing will involve expanding operations into several international markets. How many people in this room can speak directly to local communities without a translator?" One by one, the guests looked at each other. Nobody answered. Ethan cleared his throat. "We usually hire experts for that." Daniel nodded slowly. "A reasonable strategy." Then he looked at Naomi. "Young lady, if you had to choose between speaking someone's language and understanding their culture, which would you choose?" Naomi placed the dessert tray gently on the table. She smiled and answered without hesitation. "Understanding the person, sir. The language is only the door. Respect is what lets you inside." The answer stayed with the room long after Naomi Brooks finished speaking. Respect is what lets you inside. Daniel Whitaker smiled as though he had heard something valuable, something that could not be measured on a spreadsheet or negotiated across a conference table. A few investors nodded quietly. One reached for his coffee. Another looked out across the Chicago skyline, thinking. Ethan Calloway sat very still. He had built his company on numbers. Routes. Contracts. Profit margins. Delays cost money. Mistakes cost money. In his world, everything had a price. Yet somehow a waitress had spent the last half hour changing the mood of a dinner without asking for anything in return. Ethan cleared his throat. "That is a thoughtful idea," he said. "But business is different from conversation. In business, results matter." Daniel looked at him. "I agree completely." Ethan relaxed for a moment. Daniel continued. That is why I pay close attention to how people treat those who cannot offer them anything in return. The words landed softly, but Ethan felt them. One of the investors looked toward Daniel with curiosity. Is that how you choose your partners? Daniel nodded. Partly. Character has saved me from bad investments more than once. Naomi quietly collected empty dessert plates. She did not join the discussion. She simply listened while moving around the table with the same calm grace she had shown all evening. Ethan watched her for a moment. Then he looked at Daniel. You make it sound as though one dinner conversation tells you everything about a person. Daniel smiled. Not everything, but small moments reveal habits. Habits reveal character. Character reveals leadership. Another guest leaned forward. I remember reading an interview where you said your best business decision came from listening to someone everyone else ignored. Daniel laughed. That is true. He looked toward Naomi. In fact, I have spent my life believing that good ideas often arrive wearing ordinary clothes. Naomi almost smiled but kept working. The restaurant manager approached quietly and whispered something in her ear. She nodded and stepped away toward the kitchen. As she disappeared through the doors, the room somehow felt different. Ethan noticed it. The conversation slowed. The attention shifted back to business, but not completely. One investor finally spoke. I have to admit, I am curious. What does a woman like that do serving tables? Ethan answered before anyone else could. People have different paths. Daniel looked at him. They do. Some are chosen. Some are temporary. Ethan picked up his coffee cup. You seem very interested in her story. Daniel nodded. I am interested in anyone who spends an entire evening showing patience under pressure. Ethan smiled politely. I think you are giving this situation more meaning than it deserves. Daniel did not argue. He simply looked toward the kitchen doors. Perhaps. The doors opened again. Naomi returned carrying a fresh pot of coffee. She moved from guest to guest, offering refills. When she reached Daniel, he thanked her. When she reached Ethan, she paused politely. Would you care for more coffee, sir? Ethan looked up at her. For the first time that evening, he noticed something beyond the uniform and the name tag. He noticed confidence. Not arrogance. Not pride. Just quiet confidence. He handed her his cup. Yes, thank you. Naomi filled it carefully. Daniel watched the exchange with a thoughtful expression. Then he looked at Ethan and said, There is one thing I have not told anyone at this table tonight. Every conversation stopped. Daniel folded his hands together and smiled. This dinner was never only about expanding a business partnership. I came here looking for someone with the judgment to lead a very different project, and I think I have finally found the person I wanted to meet. The entire table looked at Daniel Whitaker, waiting for him to finish. Even the soft piano music from the lobby seemed farther away than before. Naomi Brooks stood quietly with the coffee pot in her hands, unsure whether she should step away or stay. Daniel noticed her hesitation and smiled. Please do not leave, young lady, he said. You are part of this conversation now. Naomi nodded politely and remained where she was. Ethan Calloway folded his hands together. You have my attention, he said with a confident smile. What kind of project are you talking about? Daniel looked around the room before answering. 3 years ago, my foundation started building an international education initiative. The goal was simple: connect students, small businesses, and local communities across different cultures. We have schools waiting for support. We have partners overseas waiting for investment. What we need is leadership. One of the investors leaned forward. That sounds like a remarkable opportunity. Daniel nodded. It is. But I learned a long time ago that leadership is not about the loudest voice in the room. It is about the person who can make strangers trust each other. Ethan smiled. That happens to be one of my strengths. Daniel looked at him kindly. I know your business record very well. Your company is impressive. Ethan relaxed. Thank you. Daniel continued. But I have spent this evening watching something more important than balance sheets. The room grew quiet again. Daniel turned toward Naomi. I watched a young woman hear an unkind remark and answer with grace. I watched her make people feel respected. I watched her speak to every guest exactly the same way, whether they were a billionaire or a busboy. Naomi looked down for a moment. I was only doing my job, sir. Daniel smiled. Perhaps. But character has a way of revealing itself through ordinary work. Ethan shifted in his chair. Surely you are not suggesting that a waitress should lead an international project. Daniel did not seem offended. I am suggesting that talent appears in unexpected places. One of the investors nodded. I agree with that. Another added, I have hired people because of conversations much shorter than this one. Ethan looked around the table. He realized that no one was laughing anymore. No one was dismissing the idea. Daniel looked at Naomi again. Tell me something. If you could build a bridge between two communities that do not understand each other, where would you start? Naomi thought for a second. At the dinner table, sir. Daniel smiled. Why? Because people argue less when they break bread together. My grandmother believed that sharing a meal reminds people they have more in common than they think. Daniel laughed softly. That sounds exactly like something my mother used to say. Ethan looked at Naomi with a new expression. It was not admiration. Not yet. It was confusion. He had spent the evening trying to understand how a waitress could answer every question so naturally. Daniel reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a small leather notebook. He opened it carefully and looked at one page before closing it again. I have spent months interviewing executives for this project, he said. Some had perfect resumes. Some had extraordinary wealth. Some had powerful connections. He looked directly at Naomi. Tonight, I met someone who reminded me that education is not measured by titles. It is measured by what you do when another person is standing in front of you. Naomi smiled politely. That is very kind of you to say, sir. Daniel shook his head. No, young lady. Kindness would be offering a compliment. I am talking about an opportunity, and before this evening ends, I would like to know whether you would even consider hearing my proposal. Naomi Brooks stood perfectly still, convinced she had misunderstood what Daniel Whitaker had just said. Around the table, the investors looked from Daniel to Naomi and back again, waiting for her answer. The city lights outside the windows reflected across the glass, turning the Chicago skyline into a sea of gold. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed through the night, but inside the private dining room nobody seemed to hear it. Daniel smiled kindly. I know this must sound unexpected, he said. I am not asking for an answer tonight. I am asking whether you would be willing to have a conversation. Naomi held the coffee pot a little tighter. Sir, I appreciate your generosity, but I think you may have the wrong person. Daniel shook his head. I do not think so. Ethan Calloway leaned back in his chair. Daniel, with all due respect, you know nothing about her business experience. Daniel looked at him. That is true. Ethan nodded. Then surely qualifications matter. Daniel smiled. They do. That is why I spent the entire evening watching. Ethan frowned slightly. Watching what? Daniel folded his hands together. How people treated one another. The room grew quiet again. Daniel continued. I watched a young woman remain patient under pressure. I watched her answer disrespect with dignity. I watched her make strangers feel welcome. I watched her solve uncomfortable moments without creating new ones. One of the investors nodded. Leadership. Daniel smiled. Exactly. Naomi looked at Daniel. Sir, I work 6 days a week. I serve tables. I help my younger brother with college applications. I volunteer at a community library on Saturdays. I am not sure I belong in the kind of project you are describing. Daniel's eyes brightened. You volunteer at a library? Naomi nodded. My grandmother believed that if someone helped you climb, you should leave the ladder behind for someone else. Daniel laughed softly. I knew I liked your grandmother. Ethan listened quietly. Something about the conversation bothered him, although he could not explain why. He had spent years interviewing executives with impressive degrees and polished speeches. Daniel seemed far more interested in a waitress who spent weekends helping children read books. One of the investors looked at Naomi. What languages do you teach at the library? Naomi smiled. Mostly English. Sometimes Spanish. Sometimes Arabic if a family asks for help. Daniel looked around the table. Do you see what I see? A guest answered. Someone who builds connections. Another added. Someone who serves her community. Ethan looked down at his coffee cup. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket once more and placed a small card on the table. He slid it gently toward Naomi. This is my direct number, he said. I would like to introduce you to the people leading our international education initiative. Naomi looked at the card but did not pick it up. Sir, there are probably hundreds of people more qualified than I am. Daniel smiled. There are certainly people with longer resumes. I am not sure there are many with a stronger heart. The restaurant manager quietly approached the table, looking nervous. Excuse me, Naomi, he said softly. I am sorry to interrupt, but your shift ended almost 30 minutes ago. Naomi looked surprised. She had completely lost track of time. Daniel smiled. Then I hope nobody minds if I ask one final question before she leaves. The table nodded. Daniel looked at Naomi. If you could teach one lesson to every future business leader in America, what would it be? Naomi thought for only a second. She looked around the table, meeting every pair of eyes before answering. Never decide what someone is worth before you learn their story. Naomi Brooks looked at every face around the table before answering Daniel Whitaker's question. Never decide what someone is worth before you learn their story. The words settled over the room in a way that expensive speeches rarely could. Nobody rushed to answer. Nobody reached for a phone. Even the restaurant manager stood quietly for a second before remembering why he had walked over in the first place. Daniel smiled and slowly stood from his chair. The other guests followed without thinking. One by one, investors, executives, and business leaders rose to their feet. Naomi looked confused. "Sir, you do not have to stand," she said softly. Daniel laughed. "Actually, I do." He looked around the table. Respect should never be saved for people with impressive titles. A few guests nodded. Someone began to clap. Another joined in. Within seconds, the private dining room filled with warm applause. Naomi lowered her eyes, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Ethan Callaway remained seated for a moment. He watched Daniel. He watched the investors. He watched his own executives standing beside their chairs. Then he slowly stood as well. The applause faded, but the feeling remained. Daniel picked up the small card he had placed on the table and handed it directly to Naomi. "I hope you will call me," he said. Naomi accepted it carefully. "Thank you, sir." Daniel shook his head. "I think we are past, sir. Please call me Daniel." Naomi smiled. "Thank you, Daniel." Ethan looked out toward the city lights and let out a quiet breath. The evening had not gone the way he planned. He had expected contracts and negotiations. Instead, he had spent hours watching a stranger earn the respect of everyone in the room without asking for it. One of the investors looked at Naomi. "I have a daughter starting college next year. I hope she grows up to have your confidence." Another guest smiled. "My company works with community education programs. I would love to hear more about the library where you volunteer." Naomi thanked them politely. She answered every question with the same quiet warmth she had shown all evening. Daniel watched with satisfaction. Then he turned toward Ethan. "You built an extraordinary business," he said. Ethan nodded. "I have been fortunate." Daniel smiled. "Fortune helps. Good people help even more." Ethan understood the meaning behind the words. For the first time that evening, he looked directly at Naomi instead of through her. "Miss Brooks," he said. Naomi turned toward him. "Yes, sir?" Ethan hesitated. The room waited. "I owe you an apology." Naomi did not speak. Ethan continued. "Earlier tonight, I made assumptions about you that I should not have made. I believed I understood the room better than everyone else. I was wrong." The dining room stayed quiet. Daniel smiled but said nothing. Naomi looked at Ethan and gave a small nod. "Thank you for saying that." Ethan looked surprised. "That is all." Naomi smiled gently. "People make mistakes. What matters is what they choose to learn from them." Ethan laughed quietly. "You always have an answer, do not you?" Naomi shook her head. "No, sir. Just a grandmother who asked a lot of questions." A few guests laughed softly. The tension that had filled the room at the beginning of the night was gone. The restaurant manager stepped forward and handed Naomi her coat. "You really are off the clock now," he whispered with a smile. Naomi thanked him and turned back toward the table. Daniel picked up his jacket. "I have one last request before we all leave," he said. "Tomorrow morning, I would like to invite everyone in this room to breakfast. No speeches, no contracts, just a conversation." He looked at Naomi. "And I hope our guest of honor will join us, because I have a feeling tonight was only the beginning of her story." The next morning, the sun climbed over Chicago and painted the glass towers with a warm golden light. Naomi Brooks stood outside the St. Clair Hotel, holding the small card Daniel Whitaker had given her the night before. She almost stayed home. More than once she had looked at the card and wondered if the entire evening had been a misunderstanding. People like Daniel Whitaker did not usually invite people like her to breakfast meetings. At least that was what the world had taught her. Then she heard her grandmother's voice in her memory. "Do not let fear answer a question that life is asking you." Naomi smiled and walked through the front doors. The private dining room looked different in the daylight. The candles were gone. The city lights had been replaced by bright morning sunshine. Daniel stood to greet her. So did every investor from the night before. Ethan Callaway stood as well. Naomi stopped for a second. Daniel laughed. I told you yesterday that respect should not depend on titles. Naomi smiled. Good morning, everyone. Breakfast was simple. Coffee, fresh fruit, eggs, warm bread. Nobody talked about contracts during the first few minutes. They talked about families, favorite books, places they had traveled, and teachers who had changed their lives. Naomi fit into every conversation naturally. Daniel watched quietly. Finally, he placed a folder on the table. Naomi, he said, inside this folder is an invitation to join our international education initiative. We want you to help build community partnerships and language programs across the country. We will provide training and support, but what we cannot teach is what you already have. Naomi looked at the folder but did not open it. Why me? She asked softly. Daniel smiled. Because last night, a room full of successful people learned something from a waitress, and not one of us forgot it. Ethan looked at Naomi. I would like to say something too. Naomi turned toward him. Ethan took a slow breath. I built my company believing that confidence meant always having the answer. Yesterday, I learned that confidence can also mean listening. Naomi smiled. Ethan continued. You changed my perspective, and I am grateful for that. In fact, I would like to partner with Daniel's foundation and support the education program. I think my company has some learning to do as well. Daniel laughed. Now that sounds like a worthwhile investment. The room filled with quiet smiles. Naomi finally opened the folder. She looked through the pages and then looked back at Daniel. My grandmother used to tell me that opportunity should never make you forget where you came from. Daniel nodded. A wise woman again. Naomi closed the folder gently. Then I will accept, but I have one condition. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Name it. Naomi smiled. I want our first project to be in neighborhoods where children think big dreams belong to someone else. Daniel stood and held out his hand. You have a deal. Ethan stood too. Then the investors followed. Morning sunlight filled the room as hands were shaken and plans were made. Outside, the city hurried through another ordinary day, unaware that something extraordinary had happened inside one hotel dining room. A billionaire had discovered that money could not buy wisdom. A group of leaders had learned that talent does not always wear an expensive suit. And a young black waitress who had walked into work expecting an ordinary shift walked out carrying a future she had earned long before anyone bothered to notice. Her grandmother had been right all along. The person everyone ignored had understood the room better than the people trying to control it.